I want to start with something I saw that I genuinely haven't been able to stop thinking about. A few months ago, I was sitting in a coffee shop just working, and at the table next to me there were two guys, mid-20s. Both had their laptops open, gaming, not really talking, just coexisting in silence for like 2 hours. Then one of them packed up, said later, and left. No plans mentioned, no same time next week, just silence, then gone. And what got me wasn't the silence, it was how completely normal it looked. Not sad, not dramatic, just ordinary, like that was just how things were now. Here's the thing, if I'd seen that 10 years ago, I'd have assumed those two guys had a fight. Now I watch it and think, that's probably just a Tuesday for them. That's the baseline. That moment kind of broke something open for me. Because I study relationship psychology. I look at what creates connection and what quietly erodes it. And what I've been watching happen, not just in relationships, but in how men relate to work, to purpose, to each other, is something most people are wildly under-reading. So let me walk you through it. Because this isn't about bashing men, and it's not about bashing women. It's about a pattern that's already reshaping every relationship dynamic you're going to experience in your lifetime. And most people get it completely wrong. They look at men who've checked out and say lazy, immature, afraid of responsibility. They reach for the simple explanation because the complicated one is harder to sit with. But the complicated one is the one that actually matters. Let's go back to where this story actually starts, because it didn't start recently. For generations, nearly all working-age men were in the labour force. In 1950, the participation rate sat around 97%. Not because men were somehow more disciplined back then, because the contract was clear. You work, you provide, you sacrifice, and in return you get something real. A family, respect, a reason to keep going. The deal made sense. And then slowly, quietly, the deal changed. Men's workforce participation has now dropped to 66.8%, the lowest it's been since 1948. Think about that for a second. We've gone backwards further than most people realise. 44 million eligible men are not currently in the labour force. That's 9 million more than in 2012. These aren't recession numbers. There's no economic emergency forcing this. For a lot of these men, it's not even that they can't find work. They've just opted out entirely. And yeah, I felt the instinct to judge that. But stay with me, because the judgment closes the door before we've even looked inside. Here's the first stage of what actually happens, and it starts younger than most people realise. Pew Research found that fewer men under 21 were hitting 5 key life milestones in 2021 than in 1980. Things like full-time employment, financial independence, living on their own, getting married, having kids. Only 39% of 21-year-old men were working full-time in 2021. In 1980, that number was 64%. That's not a blip. That's a generation-wide shift in trajectory. So why? What actually happened to the motivation? Over the past couple of decades, a lot of men entering adulthood have hit what I'd call moving goalposts. Work multiple jobs, get more credentials, delay everything, and do all of it on thinner wages, higher rents, with weaker safety nets than the generation before them had. So you're asking a young guy to sacrifice enormously, give everything, and the return on that sacrifice keeps shrinking. At some point, psychologically, rationally, a person stops feeding a machine that doesn't feed them back. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research actually shows this. When effort is consistently unrewarded, the rational response is to stop, to opt out entirely. This is the first stage, not laziness, a calculation, a quiet, invisible cost-benefit analysis that millions of men are running individually, alone, without talking about it. And the answer keeps coming back the same way. It's not worth it. But here's where it gets more complicated. And honestly, this is the part that changes everything once you actually understand it. Because it's not just economic. The economic piece is real, but there's something underneath it. Think about what men have historically gotten from the social contract. Not just money, purpose, a clearly defined role that gave their existence weight. I matter because I contribute. I belong because I provide. I'm significant because there are people who need what only I can give. Now, what happens when that role gets deconstructed? When the culture says, and I'm not saying this is wrong, I'm saying we have to understand the effect. When the culture says the traditional male contribution is no longer special, is no longer needed in the same way, what does a man orient around instead? The masculinity recession isn't driven by men refusing to adapt. It's driven by a society that dismantled the old pathways to purpose, without building new ones men could realistically step into. The result is a growing population of men who feel surplus to requirements, present but no longer needed. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because it's the psychological engine behind almost everything else I'm about to tell you. Here's stage 2, and this is the one that hits relationships most directly. When a man loses his sense of purpose, he doesn't usually announce it. He doesn't sit down and say, "I'm having a crisis of meaning." That's not how most men process. He goes quiet, he pulls back, he picks up a screen, a game, something that gives him a dopamine return without requiring the kind of sacrifice that stopped making sense. A 2024 longitudinal study found that loneliness increases the risk of problem gaming, while problem gaming deepens loneliness and stress in young adult males. Which is wild when you think about it. The thing men retreat into to escape the discomfort ends up amplifying it. More isolated, more disconnected, more avoidant of the things that might actually reconnect them, and the friendship data here is just jarring. In 1990, the General Social Survey found 3% of American men reported having 0 close friends. By 2021, that had risen to 15%. By 2023, 1 in 5 American men said they had 0 close friends. 1 in 5. That's men making decisions about their entire lives. Whether to commit, whether to keep trying, with essentially no one to talk to about it. No reality check. No perspective from someone who actually knows them. Pew Research's 2025 study found that 74% of men would first turn to a spouse or partner for emotional support. Way more than they'd reach out to friends or family. So when men are single, which a growing number are, they've got nobody. 20% of single men report 0 close friends. They're not just alone in the relationship sense, they're alone in the emotional infrastructure sense. And that isolation doesn't make them more open to trying harder. It makes them more closed, more defended, more likely to decide that the risk of engaging just isn't worth it. Now here's the part I think women in particular need to hear, because the question I get constantly is, why are men pulling back from commitment? Why aren't they trying? Why do they seem less available? And the answer most people give is selfish, afraid. They want all the benefits without the work. I think that's too simple, and I think it misses the most important piece. These are men who believe they did what was asked and still fell behind. They showed up, they tried the path, and what came back didn't match what was promised, so they stopped trying the path. In 2019, less than a third of young men felt they experienced gender-based discrimination. 4 years later, 45% of young men believed they were facing it. Now, I'm not here to say whether that perception is accurate. What matters for understanding behavior is that the perception is real to them. And when a person feels like the environment is hostile to their existence, they don't lean in, they contract. When a man is told his experience is exaggeration, and his attempts at honest conversation get met with, "Everyone has it tough," withdrawal starts to look less like giving up, and more like self-preservation. That's the psychology underneath the silence. Not weakness, not entitlement, self-protection. From a world that kept telling him his experience didn't count, and here's what that does to relationships. When a man doesn't feel seen in the broader culture, he stops looking for that feeling in relationships too. He stops trying to earn something he suspects isn't available to him. He retreats into a life that asks less and gives predictable returns. Now, I want to be really careful here because this is where the conversation either gets useful or gets toxic, and I refuse to let it get toxic. This is not a war between men and women. It never was. What I'm describing is a pattern, a psychological pattern, that's creating distance between two groups of people who actually want the same things underneath all of it. Connection, meaning, to feel like they matter to someone. Gallup's 2025 data found that 25% of American men between 15 and 34 1 in 4 report feeling lonely every single day. Research from Brigham Young University found that chronic loneliness carries a mortality risk equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And nearly 4 in 5 deaths by suicide in the US in 2022 were men. These aren't numbers that describe men who don't care. These are numbers that describe men who are hurting in ways society doesn't have good language for, and that they themselves don't have good language for, and who are disappearing quietly into that pain. Here's how that connects directly to your relationships. A man who's secretly at that level of distress, isolated, purposeless, feeling unseen, is not going to show up fully. He'll take the available exit when things get hard. He'll struggle to communicate what he's actually feeling because he barely knows himself. He'll look like he doesn't care when really he's just been running on empty so long he's forgotten what full feels like. That's not an excuse, but it is an explanation, and explanations are how we build something better. So what do you actually do with all of this? If you're a woman trying to understand why the men in your life seem less invested, less present, less willing to go all in, stop asking what's wrong with him and start asking, what did he walk away from before he got to me? Because that story is almost always the missing piece. A man who's been chronically unrecognized, who's been told his contribution doesn't matter, who tried and failed until the trying stopped making emotional sense. That man isn't going to risk vulnerability easily. He needs to see that the environment he's stepping into is different from the one that burned him. And he needs time to actually believe it before he'll let himself believe it. That takes patience. But more than patience, it takes seeing him clearly. Not as a project. Not as someone broken who needs fixing. As someone who did the math, didn't like the answer, and is still standing there trying to figure out if there's a different equation. And if you're a man watching this, if any of this landed with the weight of recognition, I want to say something directly to you. Opting out might feel like clarity, and sometimes it genuinely is, but there's a difference between choosing freedom and choosing disappearance. One is an act of self-possession, the other is an act of self-erasure, and a lot of men I watch are calling it the first thing when it's actually the second. Richard Reeves, president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, has pointed out that men rely more on face-to-face interaction to maintain social connection and have a harder time rebounding from loneliness, which means the further you retreat, the harder it gets to come back. Not impossible, just harder. The path forward isn't back to the old contract. That contract was broken for real reasons, and pretending otherwise helps nobody. But the path forward also isn't permanent withdrawal. It's building something new. Relationships, friendships, a sense of purpose, on terms that actually make sense for who you are right now. Here's the one thing I'll leave you with. A society shapes itself around what men decide to invest in. Families, communities, work, love. When men disengage from those things, the loss is real. Not just for men, but for everyone connected to them. But shaming men back to the table has never worked, and it never will. What works, what has always worked, is making the table worth sitting at again. That starts with understanding, and understanding starts with asking better questions than what's wrong with them. Start there. Everything else follows.